Recently, I introduced you to the Book of Hope. The Book of Hope is the book of Jonah. I call it the Book of Hope because in the beginning of the book, as you read through it, it appears that there is no hope and no one cares but God. You see that God cares in chapter 4 and verse 11, the very last verse in the book of Jonah. And recently we just looked at Jonah chapter 1 and verse 2, and you see God's patience with Nineveh. God's patience with Nineveh, that God commissioned Jonah to go to Nineveh and preach to Nineveh. Now, every one of us here are probably familiar with the game of chess. In the game of chess, you make a move and there's a counter move. You make a move, there's a counter move. Well, I want you to understand something, a very important word as you read the scripture. That word is a three-letter word. It is but. Whenever but appears, something changes. And I find it very interesting when God butts in. In this book of Jonah, chapter 1 and verse 2, we see that God commissioned Jonah to go to Nineveh. And he told him to go. And then in verse 3, he says, but Jonah rose to flee to Joppa. So what do we find? That he went down, he got into a ship. Verse 4, but the Lord sent a great wind into the sea. But in verse 5, Jonah was gone down into the sides of the ship to sleep. And as you continue to read, the mariners woke him up and eventually tossed him overboard to be swallowed up by a great sea monster. And then as he's in the belly of this great sea monster, we find in chapter 2 and verse 8, he says, they that observe lying vanities forsake their own mercy. But, he says in verse 9, I will sacrifice unto the Lord with the voice of thanksgiving. And then eventually we find that he is now spit up and he goes to Nineveh and he begins to preach. And as he preached, the people repented. Chapter 4, verse 1, but it displeased Jonah. And as you continue to read, you find that God created a great gourd that he could rest under it and be comforted. And then in the night, it says in verse 7, but God prepared a worm. The worm destroyed the gourd, which got his attention. And I say that to check out the word but every time you read it. Now, having said that, we tend to judge things a little too quickly. It looks like we're going to take the snapshot here and say, this is it. Then we find out later, oh, there's more to the story. And I want to share with you something that Max Lucado had written. And I think it's very important for us today in the light of things that we see going on. This is called the Woodcutter's Wisdom. Once there was an old man who lived in a tiny village. Although he was envied by all, he owned a beautiful white horse. Even the king coveted his treasure. A horse like this had never been seen before. Such was its splendor, its majesty, its strength. People offered fabulous prices for the steed, but the old man always refused. This horse is not a horse to me, he would tell them. It is a person. How could you sell a person? He is a friend, not a possession. How could you sell a friend? The man was poor and the temptation was great, but he never sold a horse. One morning, he found that the horse was not in the stable, and the village came to see him. You old fool, they scoffed. We told you someone would steal your horse. We warned you that you would be robbed. You are so poor, how could you ever hope to protect such a valuable animal? It would have been better to have sold him. You could have gotten whatever price you wanted. No amount would have been too high. Now the horse is gone, and you've been cursed with misfortune. The old man responded, don't speak too quickly. Say only that the horse is not in the stable. That's all we know. The rest is judgment. If I've been cursed or not, how can you know? How can you judge? The people contested, don't make us out to be fools. We may not be philosophers, but philosophy is not needed. The simple fact that your horse is gone is a curse. The old man spoke again. All I know is that the stable is empty and the horse is gone. The rest I don't know. Whether it be a curse or a blessing, I can't say. All we can see is a fragment. Who can say what will come next? The people of the village laughed. They thought the man was crazy. They had always thought he was a fool. If he wasn't, he would have sold the horse and lived off the money. But instead, he was poor woodcutter, an old man, cutting firewood, dragging it in and out of the forest and selling it. He lived hand to mouth in misery of poverty. Now he had proven that he was indeed a fool. After 15 days, the horse returned. It hadn't been stolen. He had run away into the forest. Not only had he returned, he had brought a dozen wild horses with him. Once again, the village people gathered around the woodcutter and spoke. Old man, you were right. We were wrong. We thought it was a curse. It was a blessing. Please forgive us. The man responded once again, you go too far. Say only that the horse is back. State only that a dozen horses returned with him. But don't judge. How do you know if this is a blessing or not? You see only a fragment. Unless you know the whole story, how can you judge? You only read one page of a book. Can you judge the whole book? You read only one word of a phrase. Can you understand the entire phrase? Life is so vast, yet you judge all of life with one page or word, one word. All you have is a fragment. Don't say that this is a blessing. No one knows. I am content with what I know. I am not perturbed by what I don't. Maybe the old man is right, they said to one another. So they said little, but down deep they knew he was wrong. They knew it was a blessing. 12 wild horses had returned with one horse, while a little bit of work that the animals could be broken and trained and sold for much money. The old man had a son, an only son. A young man began to break the wild horses. After a few days he fell from one of the horses and broke both his legs. Once again the villagers gathered around the old man and cast their judgments. You were right, they said. You proved you were right. The dozen horses were not a blessing. They were a curse. Your only son has broken his legs. Now you're old. In your old age, you have no one to help you. Now you are poorer than ever. The old man spoke again. You people are obsessed with judging. Don't go so far. Say only my son broke his legs. Who knows if it's a blessing or a curse? No one knows. We only have a fragment of life. It comes in fragments. It so happened that a few weeks later, the country engaged in a war again with the neighboring country. All the men of the village were required to join the army. Only the son of the old man was excluded because he was injured. Once again the people gathered around the old man, crying and screaming because their sons would be taken. There was little chance they would return. The enemy was strong. The war would be a losing struggle. They would never see their sons again. You're right, old man, they wept. God knows you were right. This proves it. Your son's accident was a blessing. His legs may be broke, but at least he is with you. Our sons are gone forever. The old man spoke again. It is impossible to talk with you. You always draw conclusions. No one knows. Say only this. Your sons had to go to war, and mine did not. No one knows if it is a blessing or a curse. No one is wise enough to know, only God. The old man was right. We only have a fragment. Life's mishaps and horrors are only a page out of a grand book. We must be slow about drawing conclusions. We must reserve judgment on life's storms until we know the whole story. I don't know where the woodcutter learned his patience. Perhaps from another woodcutter in Galilee. For it was a carpenter who said it best. Do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. He should know he is the author of our story, and he's already written the final chapter. As I read that and I think about that, and I hope that you will too, in the book of Genesis in chapter 50 and verse 20, it says, when Joseph was talking to his brothers, said, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. I would have you close in thinking of this. My Father's way may twist and turn. My heart may throb and ache. But in my soul, I'm glad I know he maketh no mistake. My cherished plans may go astray. My hope may fade away. But still I'll trust my Lord to lead, for he doth know the way. Though night be dark, it may seem the day will never break. I'll pin my faith, my all in him. He maketh no mistake. So there's so much now I cannot see, my eyesight far too dim. But come what may, I'll simply trust and leave it all to him. For by and by the mist will lift, and plain it all he'll make. Through all the way, though dark to me, he made not one mistake. Think about it. There's a song that goes through it all. I've learned to trust in Jesus. I've learned to trust in God. In these days that we live, it'll be good for us to think on these things.